The harbor was unusually quiet that morning in Messina. Sailors leapt ashore, but not with their usual swagger or cheer. Their ship, trailing a foul stench and the whispers of something wrong, carried not just cargo from the east but something far more sinister. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. At first, no one knew what to make of it. A few dockworkers fell ill. Then their families. Within days, whole neighborhoods were shuttered, the streets growing silent as candlelight flickered behind boarded windows. This wasn't just a local outbreak. The sickness moved fast, too fast. It clung to clothes, to breath, to rats scuttling through the shadows. And it didn't just kill. It unraveled. Merchants, monks, mothers, no one was spared. In the early weeks, physicians tried to explain it. Bad air, celestial alignments, an imbalance of humors. But their remedies, herbs stuffed in beaks, bleeding, strange prayers, did little to stem the tide. What had sailed across the sea was no ordinary disease. It struck like lightning and spread like wildfire. From Messina, the plague rode ships up the Italian coast. Genoa, Pisa, and Venice fell in quick succession. Trade routes that once brought wealth now delivered death. By land, caravans carried contaminated goods inland. The sickness didn't respect borders, it simply followed people. Over the Alps, through France, and eventually to the bustling streets of Paris and London, the plague crept with quiet menace. Travelers told stories, entire towns emptied overnight, priests abandoning their flocks, people digging graves by the dozen before collapsing into them themselves. And then came the symptoms, gruesome and swift. A fever that boiled the skin. Buboes, like black grapes, swelling in groins and underarms. Vomiting, delirium, and then, almost always, death. It was so fast that many died in the same clothes they had worn to market that morning. Panic spread alongside the disease. Some tried to flee, believing the countryside would be safer. But they only carried death with them. Others locked their doors and waited, praying the smell of rosemary or a ring of garlic might save them. Meanwhile, cats and dogs were killed en masse, blamed for the spread, though ironically, it was the rats and their fleas, now thriving unchecked, that were the true couriers of this invisible killer. Still, life tried to go on. Bakers still lit their ovens. Bells still rang in the churches, though more often for funerals than feasts. But beneath it all, a sense of dread settled into Europe like a fog. Rumors grew wild. This was God's punishment. This was the devil's hour. This was the end of days. In many places, there wasn't even time to mourn. The dead were bundled in sheets, carted away by masked figures, and tossed into trenches. "Bring out your dead," became a chilling refrain echoing down alleyways. No one was immune. Rich or poor, learned or unlettered, it came for all. Kings died in palaces, beggars in the streets. By early 1348, England had joined the grim march. The plague had leapt across the Channel, and now its black fingers began to wrap around towns like Bristol, then London. The capital, dense and filthy, was a banquet for the disease. In some parishes, half the population vanished within months. Even the churches, the moral heart of society, grew thin. Priests, compelled to administer last rites, often caught the plague themselves. Whole monasteries emptied, leaving only silence and the smell of sickness. Funerals turned from ceremonies into quick burials, names often forgotten, bodies stacked like firewood. And yet, the worst was still to come. What began at the ports had become an unstoppable current. A dark tide flooding every corner of Europe. By the time many towns even understood what they faced, they had already lost a third of their people. This was not just a disease. It was a transformation, of bodies, of beliefs, of an entire way of life. And it had only just begun. The village of Givry in Burgundy had once rung with laughter and the clatter of carts, but by midsummer, the sounds were different. Just silence, broken by the distant tolling of a bell and the occasional sob. Where once stood bustling markets and children chasing chickens across courtyards, Now there were only empty homes, doors ajar, shutters flapping in the wind. Across Europe, scenes like this repeated themselves with haunting regularity. Cities, with their close quarters and poor sanitation, fell quickly. But the countryside, where life had always moved a little slower, was not spared. In fact, many believed they were safe under open skies, far from the filth of city air. Yet the Black Death moved with uncanny persistence. A merchant's cart, a fleeing noblewoman, a pilgrim seeking refuge, each unknowingly carried the sickness into isolated corners. And once it arrived, the result was often complete devastation. Whole villages disappeared from maps. Not because they were abandoned, but because there was simply no one left to leave. Farm tools lay rusting in the fields, looms stood still, and wells went dry. Animals wandered free, untended, sometimes turning feral. In England alone, more than 1,000 villages would never recover. Crops rotted in the soil while livestock starved, bleated, or were slaughtered en masse to stop the spread. For the survivors, daily life transformed into a grim routine. Each morning brought dread. Who would still be alive? Who would bury the ones that weren't? Families barricaded themselves indoors, living off stale bread and dwindling supplies. Sometimes, a home would go quiet, and no one would ever open its door again. Those who ventured out encountered a surreal world. In towns like Florence and Avignon, once vibrant streets were now lined with carts full of corpses. The sick, if they could move, stumbled toward churches and city gates, desperate for help or salvation. But help was scarce. Doctors, those still alive, were overwhelmed or fled. And their treatments, often based on ancient theories, were worse than useless. In some places, rich families escaped to countryside villas. But wealth couldn't shield them. Servants died, supplies ran short, and isolation turned to terror. Elsewhere, people turned on each other. Suspicion grew between neighbors. That coughing man in the market, was he cursed? Had he sinned? Was he the reason your daughter now lay cold and still? Fear bred strange behaviors. Some towns saw dancing processions, people whipping themselves in public in hopes of atoning for the sins they believed caused the plague. Others indulged in the opposite, drunken feasts, wild abandon. Live while we can, etched into every reckless act. Morality, once tightly bound by church and custom, frayed at the edges. Meanwhile, the machinery of society ground to a halt. Guilds shuttered their doors. Markets collapsed. Grain shipments stopped. In Paris, the dead outnumbered the living. In London, grave diggers were in such demand that many grew rich from death. Ironically, in a world overwhelmed by mortality, a few began profiting like never before. Daily survival demanded improvisation. People who had never worked in the fields now planted cabbages. Teenagers stepped into adult roles. Children grew up fast, or not at all. There were no apprenticeships, no festivals, no safe havens. Time itself felt different, measured not in seasons or harvests, but in waves of loss. In monasteries and castles alike, silence reigned. Libraries stopped copying books. Courts stopped holding sessions. Even war, so frequent before, paused in many places. Armies, weakened by plague, disbanded. Battles that once would have drawn hundreds now mustered a few cautious knights who fought with more wariness than fury. The idea of normal life slipped away. The world was changing, but it wasn't clear yet what it was becoming. All people knew was this: the old rhythms were broken. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed customs, expectations, habits. And in that space, between the old world and whatever would come next, there was only uncertainty. Still, the wheels of life creaked forward. A girl fed her younger brother with the last crust of bread. A blacksmith, alone in his forge, hammered out nails for coffins. A widow lit a candle, her hands shaking, whispering prayers that had failed so many before her. Europe had not yet understood just how deep the change would go. But the bones beneath the fields, the silence in the villages, and the strange new shapes of daily survival were all writing the same message. This was not just a pause. This was the unraveling of a whole way of life. The churches had always been the anchor. Through feast days and funerals, births and blessings, the rhythm of medieval life pulsed with sacred rituals. But now, with bells ringing endlessly for the dead and priests collapsing mid-sermon, that rhythm had fractured. Faith remained, but it had changed. Something dark, raw, and questioning had begun to bubble underneath. When the plague first struck, people turned instinctively to God. Processions filled the streets, rosaries clutched, incense trailing behind trembling hands. But the prayers didn't stop the dying. Holy water couldn't cleanse the air. Even the most devout found their faith shaken when their priest lay beside their children in the same shallow grave. In this spiritual vacuum, wild beliefs took root. Some claimed it was punishment from heaven, a divine correction for sins too great to name. Others believed the devil walked among them, sowing disease like seeds in a field. But the need for answers soon turned into a need for scapegoats. Whispers began, low at first, then louder. Rumors flew that certain groups had poisoned wells, conspired in secret, or invoked dark magic. In many parts of Europe, Jews were the primary targets. Centuries of simmering tension and deep-rooted prejudice erupted into horror. Accused of spreading the plague, Jewish communities faced massacres, expulsions, and forced conversions. In Strasbourg, hundreds were burned alive. In Mainz and Cologne, entire quarters were wiped out, not by disease, but by mob violence. The Church sometimes intervened, urging mercy, declaring the accusations false. But in other places, silence, or even complicity, reigned. Fear overrode doctrine. And where persecution failed to satisfy, people turned inward, hoping personal atonement could save them. Enter the flagellants. Groups of men, stripped to the waist, marched from town to town, chanting hymns and whipping themselves bloody. They believed that by suffering publicly, they could cleanse the sins of all mankind. Crowds gathered to watch these strange pilgrimages. For a moment, it felt like someone was in control, like the world could be righted through pain. But the Church grew uneasy. These movements often spiraled into fanaticism, sometimes violence. Eventually, the Pope banned them. But the image of the self-flagellating procession remained burned into the collective memory, desperate, haunting, unforgettable. Meanwhile, inside churches that still stood, a quiet struggle unfolded. Priests wrestled with doubt. If the righteous died alongside the wicked, what did that mean for divine justice? Monks who once copied scriptures now spent their days digging graves. The sheer number of deaths overwhelmed all capacity for spiritual care. Last rites, once sacred, became rushed. Confessions were skipped. Even burials became anonymous. Still, some clergy clung to duty. In plague-stricken villages, they stayed behind when others fled, ministering to the sick, burying the dead, knowing full well they'd be next. Their sacrifice became a quiet kind of heroism, one history often overlooks. Yet many others ran, leaving their flocks behind. This betrayal deepened public distrust. People sought answers elsewhere. Amulets, charms, potions brewed by village herbalists. The line between religion and superstition blurred. In some towns, astrologers rose in popularity, casting charts to predict who would die next. Others believed in plague saints, invented on the spot, whispered from one family to the next. And still, the Church itself was transforming. With so many priests dead, replacements had to be ordained quickly, often with little education. The result was a patchwork clergy, uneven in knowledge and behavior. Some were noble and selfless. Others were barely literate, driven more by opportunity than calling. The spiritual authority of the Church, once ironclad, now wore cracks. Worse still, the relic trade exploded. With so much death and despair, people sought divine protection. Sellers offered bits of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, vials of holy blood, most of them fake. Desperation made people believe. And yet, even amidst all this confusion, something new stirred in the shadows: doubt. Not disbelief. Europe was far from secular, but a seed of questioning had been planted. If the Church could not protect them, could not explain the plague, could not save the innocent, then perhaps it was fallible. That idea, dangerous and slow to take root, would later feed the minds of reformers and rebels. But for now, Europe wandered through a spiritual fog. Some clung tighter to rituals. Others broke away entirely. Many hovered in between, caught in the uncomfortable space where the old answers no longer sufficed, and new ones had yet to be born. And in that silence, between prayer and panic, between incense and screams, something deeper than death was happening: the transformation of the European soul. By the early 1350s, the worst of the Black Death had passed. But what remained was not just grief. It was a shattered labor force, upturned power structures, and a silent, simmering shift in the balance between rich and poor. In the ashes of catastrophe, peasants and workers, once tethered tightly to land and lord, began to notice something remarkable. Their work now had leverage. The math was simple. Where once there were 10 men to till a field, now there were 3. And those 3 knew it. Fields went unplowed. Mills stood idle. Sheep grazed without shepherds. Landowners, desperate to maintain their estates, found themselves offering better terms to anyone who would work. Wages rose, not by law or charity, but by sheer necessity. In England, this new dynamic hit like a thunderclap. Serfs who had long been bound to the land suddenly found themselves courted by neighboring manors. A good plowman could name his price. A skilled carpenter might travel village to village, turning down offers. And for the first time in generations, the lowest rungs of society began to climb. It didn't sit well with the elite. Kings and nobles tried to claw back control. In 1351, England passed the Statute of Labourers, a desperate decree attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force people to work where they always had. But laws written in ink could not outpace reality etched in blood. People ignored the statutes. Landowners defied them when it suited their needs. The economy had changed, and paper proclamations couldn't turn back the clock. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded. In Italy, textile workers demanded better pay. In France, agricultural laborers walked away from overworked fields and underpaid tasks. In the Holy Roman Empire, towns that had struggled to fill their guilds now welcomed outsiders and former serfs, broadening access to trades once tightly guarded. A peasant who might once have spent his whole life sowing grain on the same estate began to imagine something else: a new village, a new life, perhaps even a bit of freedom. Whole families relocated. The rigid chains of feudal loyalty, so central before, grew loose. And yet, this wasn't a sudden revolution. It was slow, uneven, and often resisted. Landowners didn't simply accept the shift. Many doubled down on control, enforcing harsh rules or trying to reassert dominance through violence. But they faced a new problem: they couldn't replace the dead. Labor was now the most precious commodity in Europe, and workers knew it. Markets, too, adapted. With fewer people, goods became scarcer, and prices fluctuated. Luxury items, once reserved for nobles, trickled down to the rising class of tradesmen and merchants. A widow might inherit land. A blacksmith might earn enough to send his son to a cathedral school. Possibility was no longer the exclusive domain of the rich. Of course, this didn't happen everywhere. Some regions, particularly those hardest hit, took decades to recover. But the trend was clear. The world had been cracked open, and something new was seeping through. And with this shift came resistance. In places like Flanders and England, peasant uprisings flared. The most famous, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, echoed with the voices of workers tired of being treated like cattle. They had tasted the possibility of a fair wage, of mobility, of respect, and they weren't going back without a fight. The leaders of these revolts, Wat Tyler, John Ball, and others, weren't kings or bishops. They were everyday men, emboldened by loss and awakened to injustice. Their cries weren't revolutionary manifestos, but simple, powerful demands. We are men, not beasts. Why should we be kept down? The revolts were often crushed, their leaders executed, their followers punished. But the ideas didn't die. They lingered, whispered from field to forge, passed between families. The notion that birth did not have to dictate destiny was out in the open. In some corners, towns gained autonomy. Former serfs purchased their freedom. Even the church, struggling to fill empty pulpits, allowed commoners into ranks once reserved for the educated elite. Education, however limited, trickled downward. Latin wasn't just for monks anymore. What the plague had done, without intention, without mercy, was to shake the foundations of a centuries-old hierarchy. The soil of Europe was still stained with death, but in it, new roots had begun to take hold. And for the first time in a very long time, the people who worked the land could look up, not just to the heavens for salvation, but across the fields, wondering what more life might offer. Somewhere in the Midlands, a nobleman stared out over his depleted estate. Once teeming with servants and farmhands, his manor now echoed with absence. Fields he once watched with pride now lay overgrown, hedges unruly, the barns half empty. The Black Death had stolen more than lives, it had taken his control. Across Europe, the aristocracy was in quiet crisis. The traditional bonds that once tethered serfs to lords were unraveling. For centuries, power had trickled from the top, kings to nobles, nobles to knights, knights to peasants. But the foundation, the mass of laborers who tilled, spun, harvested, cooked, cleaned, and carried, had cracked. Without that bedrock, the entire structure began to list. The old world had operated on certainty. A man was born into his station, and there he stayed. But now, movement stirred beneath the surface. Former peasants, having tasted choice during the labor shortages, were less obedient. No, had become a word they dared to say. Elsewhere was a place they dared to go. Landowners tried to push back. They reinforced rules, increased fines, and reimposed feudal obligations where they could. But the illusion of permanence was gone. In many places, rents shifted from labor-based obligations to cash payments. Serfs became tenants. Lords became landlords. And once money entered the equation, so too did bargaining. This shift rippled through society in strange and subtle ways. Dress codes emerged, enforced by sumptuary laws, rules meant to prevent commoners from dressing above their station. It was a nervous reaction from the elite, who began noticing merchants in furs and artisans in silks. If the lower classes could wear wealth, what did that say about the natural order? Education followed. Literacy crept downward. Sons of blacksmiths might attend grammar schools. Daughters of merchants might learn to read. And as more people handled money, accounts, and contracts, basic numeracy became a valuable skill. The world was getting more complex, and knowledge was now as useful as bloodlines. In towns and growing cities, new classes began to coalesce, either noble nor peasant. The bourgeoisie, the middle stratum of shopkeepers, guild masters, and professionals found room to grow. They didn't own vast estates, but they had gold, property, and influence. Their rise posed a silent threat to the nobility, whose power had always rested on land and legacy. The church, too, was transforming. With so many learned clergy gone, the gap between doctrine and daily practice widened. Parish priests often came from humble origins now, and while some were devout, others were opportunists. Corruption and laxity crept in. Simony, indulgences, and clerical scandals eroded trust. Yet in the background, a new wind stirred: humanism. Quiet at first, it began in Italy, where scholars dusted off ancient Roman texts and started to ask questions. If man could suffer so much and survive, Perhaps he wasn't just a sinful creature awaiting grace. Perhaps he had value in himself. All of this, shifting power, rising classes, spreading knowledge, made the old feudal order look tired, like a faded tapestry stretched too thin. Even within noble households, changes flickered. Daughters, once traded like coins in marriage deals, now had more leverage. Fewer eligible heirs meant more attention on alliances, and educated women gained subtle influence in matters of land and law. They were still bound, still limited, but the cage had cracks. Architecture began to reflect the shift. Castles, once built for defense, became homes with larger windows and gardens. Townhouses grew in style and comfort. In Italy and parts of France, the seeds of the Renaissance were already blooming: art, sculpture, thought. But it wasn't just a story of upward motion. Many nobles, resisting change, tightened their grip. They waged local wars, cracked down on tenant rights, or moved into courts to curry royal favor. The gap between conservative landholders and adaptive lords widened. Some fell into ruin. Others pivoted, leasing land, investing in trade, marrying into merchant families. The biggest irony? Many nobles, who once sneered at trade, now depended on it. The silk that clothed their wives, the spices on their tables, the books in their libraries, these came from the hands and ships of people they once deemed beneath them. The plague had not just emptied halls and chapels. It had loosened every rope that held medieval society in place. Now, like a ship at sea, the social order rocked, uncertain of its direction, vulnerable to the next strong wind. But beneath the chaos, a quiet truth had emerged: the world would not go back to the way it was. And the lords who still sat in their towers, polishing titles and clinging to customs, would soon find themselves part of a fading world, one being replaced not by rebellion, but by reinvention. Smoke curled from chimneys in Florence once again. Markets bustled, though not quite as before. Children laughed in the streets, but some looked over their shoulders. The Black Death had retreated, but it had left fingerprints on every wall, every face, every corner of Europe. And from those fingerprints, something unexpected was beginning to bloom. The most obvious change was demographic. With up to half the population gone, everything felt stretched thin, and strangely open. Land that had once been hoarded by nobles was now available for lease or sale. Fields long abandoned were being reclaimed by new hands. Entire regions had space, resources, and the freedom to shape life differently. A family that had once crammed into a one-room cottage might now claim a bit more land, a sturdier roof, a better start. Urban centers, too, began to shift. Towns that had been decimated slowly rebounded, but differently. The plague had laid bare the weaknesses in sanitation, food supply, and overcrowding. So people adapted. Cities invested in better drainage, more organized markets, and rudimentary forms of public health. Laws emerged about waste disposal, quarantine zones, and pest control. It wasn't modern hygiene, but it was a step, a realization that human choices could influence health, not just divine will. In education, the transformation was even more profound. With the death of so many clergy and scholars, schools once reserved for the elite opened their doors to a broader segment of society. Universities, struggling to fill seats, accepted more students. Some even admitted people outside the clergy. Curricula began to shift, too, not only theology, but medicine, law, and philosophy. The plague had made people curious. What was disease? How did the body work? What caused death, and how might it be prevented? This curiosity fed the fires of the Renaissance. In Italy, artists began exploring anatomy, perspective, light. Writers asked questions about human nature, not just divine command. Petrarch, Boccaccio, and others wrote not only of saints and sinners, but of people, flawed, resilient, and real. The memory of death lingered in their works, but so too did a celebration of life. And with the changing winds of art, and thought came new tools for navigating the world. The printing press, developed not long after the worst of the plague, gave rise to a new era of information. Books, once rare and precious, could be copied quickly. Ideas could spread faster than ever before. Literacy crept into classes that had never known letters. And as people read, they questioned. Religion, while still dominant, was no longer unshakable. The church had shown cracks during the plague, failures in leadership, inconsistencies in doctrine, obvious human failings. This seeded a quiet skepticism that, in time, would grow into the fires of Reformation. The notion that one might read Scripture for oneself, rather than be told its meaning, was radical, but increasingly common. Economically, the ripple effects continued. Trade routes, disrupted during the plague, reopened with new vigor. Ports rebuilt, merchants regrouped, and goods once considered luxuries, silks, spices, sugar, became more widely accessible. Banking families like the Medicis rose, bridging the worlds of commerce, politics, and art. The feudal economy, once based on land and obligation, was giving way to a market-driven world. Labor was paid for in coin. Contracts replaced customs. Towns became centers of not just trade, but governance, innovation, and culture. The city was no longer just a place to sell grain, it was a place to reinvent oneself. Socially, class lines began to blur. A merchant's daughter might marry into a struggling noble house. A craftsman might become a patron of the arts. A boy born in a village might, through education or enterprise, rise to prominence. It wasn't a meritocracy, not yet, but it was a more flexible world than before. And perhaps most haunting of all, death itself had changed. The plague had made people familiar with it, intimate even. That familiarity didn't lead to nihilism, but to urgency. If life could vanish in a week, a day, an hour, then life must be lived. That urgency pulsed through the art of the period, the rich colors, the vivid detail, the insistence on the human form. In music, it whispered in melodies that soared toward hope but always circled back to melancholy. In literature, it echoed in characters who dared to dream, grieve, love, and stumble. Europe didn't become modern overnight. The centuries to come would still see wars, persecutions, and plagues. But the trauma of the Black Death had broken the seal on the old world. It forced people to look around and ask, what matters? What works? What's possible? And from that asking, slow, stumbling, often painful, came 1,000 answers. Some were small, cleaner streets, better wages, different clothes. Others were immense: humanism, the Renaissance, the slow but irreversible erosion of feudalism. The plague had come uninvited, unwanted, unrelenting. It tore through families, cities, nations. But in its wake, amid the loss, people rebuilt. Not the same as before, but different. A little wiser. A little bolder. A little more alive.